Okay, I'm back. The B is for back. Alright, let's get this through.
Of the act of choice does not alter the relativity of each epoch. What is at the very heart and center of existentialism is the absolute character of the free commitment, by which every man realizes himself in realizing a type of humanity, a commitment always understandable to no matter whom in no matter what epoch, and its bearing upon the relativity of the cultural pattern which may result from such an absolute commitment. One must observe equally the relativity of Cartesianism and the absolute character of the Cartesian commitment. In this sense, you may say, if you like, that every one of us makes the absolute by breathing, by eating, by sleeping, or by behaving in any fashion whatsoever. There is no difference between being free, being as self-committal as existence choosing its essence, and absolute being. And there is no difference whatever between being as an absolute, temporarily localized, that is, localized in history, and universally intelligible being. This does not completely refute the charge of subjectivism. Indeed, that objection appears in several other forms, of which the first is as follows. People say to us, then it does not matter what you do, and they say this in various ways. First, they tax us with anarchy. Then they say, you cannot judge others, for there is no reason for preferring one purpose to another. Finally, they may say, everything being merely voluntary is a choice of yours. You give away with one hand which you pretend to gain with the other. These three are not very serious objections. As to the first, to say that it does not matter what you choose is not correct. In one sense, choice is possible, but what is not possible is not to choose. I can always choose, but I must know that if I do not choose, that is still a choice. This, although it may appear merely formal, is of great importance as a limit to fantasy and caprice. For when I confront a real situation, for example, that I am a sexual being, able to have relations with a being of the other sex and able to have children, I'm obliged to choose my attitude to it. And in every respect, I bear the responsibility of the choice which, in committing myself, also commits the whole of humanity. Even if my choice is determined by no a priori value whatever, it can have nothing to do with caprice. And if anyone thinks that this is only Gide's theory of the acte gratuit over again, he has failed to see the enormous difference between this theory and that of Gide. Gide does not know what a situation is. His act is one of pure caprice. In our view, on the contrary, man finds himself in an organized situation in which he is himself involved. His choice involves mankind in its entirety, and he cannot avoid choosing. Either he must remain single, or he must marry without having children, or he must marry and have children. In any case, and whichever he may choose, it is impossible for him, in respect of this situation, not to take complete responsibility. Doubtless, he chooses without reference to any pre-established value, but it is unjust to tax him with caprice. Rather, let us say that the moral choice is comparable to the construction of a work of art. But here I must at once digress to make it quite clear that we are not propounding an aesthetic morality, for our adversaries are disingenuous enough to reproach us even with that. I mention the work of art only by way of comparison. That being understood, does anyone reproach an artist when he paints a picture for not following rules established a priori? Does one ever ask What is the picture that he ought to paint? As everyone knows, there is no predefined picture for him to make. The artist applies himself to the composition of a picture, and the picture that ought to be made is precisely that which he will have made. As everyone knows, there are no aesthetic values a priori, but there are values which will appear in due course in the coherence of the picture, in the relation between the will to create and the finished work. No one can tell what the painting of tomorrow will be like. One cannot judge a painting until it is done. What has that to do with morality? We are in the same creative situation. We never speak of a work of art as irresponsible. When we are discussing a canvas by Picasso, we understand very well that the composition became what it is at the time when he was painting it, and that his works are part and parcel of his entire life. It is the same upon the plane of morality. There is this in common between art and morality, that in both we have to do with creation and invention. We cannot decide a priori what it is that should be done. I think it was made sufficiently clear to you in the case of that student who came to see me, that to whatever ethical system he might appeal, the Kantian or any other, he could find no sort of guidance whatever. He was obliged to invent the law for himself. Certainly, we cannot say that this man, in choosing to remain with his mother, that is, in taking sentiment, personal devotion, and concrete charity as his moral foundations, would be making an irresponsible choice. Nor could we do so if he preferred the sacrifice of going away to England. Man makes himself. He is not found ready-made. He makes himself by the choice of his morality, and he cannot but choose a morality. Such is the pressure of circumstances upon him. We define man only in relation to his commitments. It is therefore absurd to reproach us for irresponsibility in our choice. In the second place, people say to us, "You are unable to judge others." This is true in one sense and false in another. It is true in this sense, that whenever a man chooses his purpose and his commitment in all clearness and in all sincerity, whatever that purpose may be, it is impossible for him to prefer another. It is true in the sense that we do not believe in progress. Progress implies amelioration, but man is always the same, facing a situation which is always changing, and choice remains always a choice in the situation. The moral problem has not changed since the time when it was a choice between slavery and anti-slavery, from the time of the War of Secession, for example, until the present moment when one chooses between the MRP and the communists. We can judge, nevertheless, for, as I have said, one chooses in view of others, and in view of others one chooses himself. One can judge first, and perhaps this is not a judgment of value, but it is a logical judgment, that in certain cases choice is founded upon an error, and in others upon the truth. One can judge a man by saying that he deceives himself. Since we have defined the situation of man as one of free choice, without excuse and without help, any man who takes refuge behind the excuse of his passions, or by inventing some deterministic doctrine, is a self-deceiver. One may object, but why should he not choose to deceive himself? I reply that it is not for me to judge him morally, but I define his self-deception as an error. Here, one cannot avoid pronouncing a judgment of truth. The self-deception is evidently a falsehood, because it is a dissimulation of man's complete liberty of commitment. Upon this same level, I say that it is also a self-deception if I choose to declare that certain values are incumbent upon me. I am in contradiction with myself if I will these values, and at the same time say that they impose themselves upon me. If anyone says to me, "And what if I wish to deceive myself?" I answer, "There is no reason why you should not, but I declare that you are doing so, and that the attitude of strict consistency alone is that of good faith." Furthermore, I can pronounce a moral judgment, for I declare that freedom, in respect of concrete circumstances, can have no other end and aim but itself. And when once a man has seen that values depend upon himself, in that state of forsakenness, he can will only one thing, and that is freedom as the foundation of all values. That does not mean that he wills it in the abstract. It simply means that the actions of men of good faith have, as their ultimate significance, the quest of freedom itself as such. A man who belongs to some communist or revolutionary society wills certain concrete ends, which imply the will to freedom, but that freedom is willed in community. We will freedom for freedom's sake, in and through particular circumstances. And in thus willing freedom, we discover that it depends entirely upon the freedom of others, and that the freedom of others depends upon our own. Obviously, freedom as the definition of a man does not depend upon others, but as soon as there is a commitment, I'm obliged to will the liberty of others at the same time as my own. I cannot make liberty my aim unless I make that of others equally my aim. Consequently, when I recognize as entirely authentic that man is a being whose existence precedes his essence, and that he is a free being who cannot, in any circumstances, but will his freedom, at the same time I realize that I cannot not will the freedom of others. Thus, in the name of that will to freedom which is implied in freedom itself, I can form judgments upon those who seek to hide from themselves the wholly voluntary nature of their existence and its complete freedom. Those who hide from this total freedom, in a guise of solemnity or with deterministic excuses, I shall call cowards. Others, who try to show that their existence is necessary when it is merely an accident of the appearance of the human race on earth, I shall call scum. But neither cowards nor scum can be identified except upon the plane of strict authenticity. Thus, although the content of morality is variable, a certain form of this morality is universal. Kant declared that freedom is a will both to itself and to the freedom of others. Agreed, but he thinks that the formal and the universal suffice for the constitution of a morality. We think, on the contrary, that principles that are too abstract break down when we come to defining action. To take once again the case of that student, by what authority, in the name of what golden rule of morality, do you think he should have decided, in perfect peace of mind, either to abandon his mother or to remain with her? There are no means of judging. The content is always concrete, and therefore unpredictable. It has always to be invented. The one thing that counts is to know whether the invention is made in the name of freedom. Let us, for example, examine the two following cases, and you will see how far they are similar in spite of their difference. Let us take the mill on the Floss. We find here a certain young woman, Maggie Tulliver, who is an incarnation of the value of passion and is aware of it. She is in love with a young man, Stephen, who is engaged to another, an insignificant young woman. This Maggie Tulliver, instead of heedlessly seeking her own happiness, chooses in the name of human solidarity to sacrifice herself and to give up the man she loves. On the other hand, La Sansarevina in Stendhal's Chartreuse de Parme, believing that it is passion which endows a man with his real value, would have declared that a grand passion justifies its sacrifices, and must be preferred to the banality of such conjugal love as would unite Stephen to the little goose he was engaged to marry. It is the latter that she would have chosen to sacrifice in realizing her own happiness, and, as Stendhal shows, she would also sacrifice herself upon the plane of passion if life made that demand upon her. Here we are facing two clearly opposed moralities, but I claim that they are equivalent, seeing that in both cases the overruling aim is freedom. You can imagine two attitudes exactly similar in effect, in that one girl might prefer, in resignation, to give up her lover, while the other preferred, in fulfillment of sexual desire, to ignore the prior engagement of the man she loved. And externally, these two cases might appear the same as the two we have just cited, while being in fact entirely different. The attitude of La Saint-Severina is much nearer to that of Maggie Tulliver than to one of careless greed. Thus, you see, the second objection is at once true and false. One can choose anything, but only if it is upon the plane of free commitment. The third objection, stated by saying, "You take with one hand what you give with the other," means, at bottom, your values are not serious since you choose them yourselves. To that, I can only say that I am very sorry that it should be so, but if I have excluded God the Father, there must be somebody to invent values. We have to take things as they are, and, moreover, to say that we invent values means neither more nor less than this, that there is no sense in life a priori. Life is nothing until it is lived, but it is yours to make sense of, and the value of it is nothing else but the sense that you choose. Therefore, you can see that there is a possibility of creating a human community. I have been reproached for suggesting that existentialism is a form of humanism. People have said to me, "But you have written in your Nausée that the humanists are wrong. You have even ridiculed a certain type of humanism. Why do you now go back upon that?" In reality, the word humanism has two very different meanings. One may understand by humanism a theory which upholds man as the end in itself and as the supreme value. Humanism, in this sense, appears, for instance, in Cocteau's story Round the World in 80 Hours, in which one of the characters declares, because he is flying over mountains in an airplane, "Man is magnificent." This signifies that, although I personally have not built airplanes, I have the benefit of those particular inventions, and that I personally, being a man, can consider myself responsible for, and honored by, achievements that are peculiar to some men. It is to assume that we can ascribe value to man according to the most distinguished deeds of certain men. That kind of humanism is absurd, for only the dog or the horse would be in a position to pronounce a general judgment upon man and declare that he is magnificent, which they have never been such fools as to do, at least not as far as I know. But neither is it admissible that a man should pronounce judgment upon man. Existentialism dispenses with any judgment of this sort. An existentialist will never take man as the end, since man is still to be determined. And we have no right to believe that humanity is something to which we could set up a cult, after the manner of Auguste Comte. The cult of humanity ends in Comtean humanism, shut in upon itself, and, this must be said, in fascism. We do not want a humanism like that. But there is another sense of the word, of which the fundamental meaning is this: man is all the time outside of himself. It is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that he makes man to exist. And, on the other hand, it is by pursuing transcendent aims that he himself is able to exist. Since man is thus self-surpassing and can grasp objects only in relation to his self-surpassing, he is himself the heart and center of his transcendence. There is no other universe except the human universe, the universe of human subjectivity. This relation of transcendence as constitutive of man, not in the sense that God is transcendent, but in the sense of self-surpassing, with subjectivity, in such a sense that man is not shut up in himself, but forever present in a human universe, it is this that we call existential humanism. This is humanism because we remind man that there is no legislator but himself, that he himself, thus abandoned, must decide for himself. Also because we show that it is not by turning back upon himself, but always by seeking, beyond himself, an aim which is one of liberation, or of some particular realization, that man can realize himself as truly human. You can see from these few reflections that nothing could be more unjust than the objections people raise against us. Existentialism is nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. Its intention is not in the least that of plunging men into despair. And if by despair one means, as the Christians do, any attitude of unbelief, the despair of the existentialists is something different. Existentialism is not atheist in the sense that it would exhaust itself in demonstrations of the non-existence of God. It declares, rather, that even if God existed, that would make no difference from its point of view. Not that we believe God does exist, but we think that the real problem is not that of his existence. What man needs is to find himself again and to understand that nothing can save him from himself, not even a valid proof of the existence of God. In this sense, existentialism is optimistic. It is a doctrine of action, and it is only by self-deception, by confining their own despair with ours, that Christians can describe us as without hope.
Wants to apply it to law, right? So you can imagine some court applying this existentialism to derive greater truth from the situation presented to them. And you have to imagine that at some point they're limited by what? The depth of their inspection, I suppose. Alright. There it is. Not a lot to say about that last part. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I was only really half tuning in. I have like a wicked headache. It's like all my muscles, like on my skull. I don't feel so tender. Oh. So things done in good faith. What does he say? They're done knowing that your actions affect others and that you're the consequence of your own actions. At some point, you'll become the image of someone else's actions. You are alone in this world. So the only extension of the self that exists is your ability to trust others. So you must be trustworthy. You must like tell the truth. You can't just do anything because there are results that we recognize as the basis of the present. But anyone else can do anything because ultimately you're only responsible for yourself. So in a lot of ways, existentialism fails to regulate its own sort of like movement. Which is why, you know, when I imagine this as a court, I now have to think, well, no, I'm not being very much of an existentialist, am I? But it's from the cogito that we begin, so we're already beginning from the philosophical basis of nothing being necessarily substantiated. So at the very least, existentialism gives us this basis for reality. So I don't like I don't like how he's like this classist asshole that co-ops the working man's work and presumes that that's the order of reality. But you know, what are you gonna do? That's why it's important to see yourself as a leader, to be optimistic and whatnot. But also why it's important to mention how drugs can affect you and how your habits can't be so self-destructive in specific terms, because in non-specific terms, and like I said, like if you're ultimately responsible for yourself, then you're not responsible for educating anyone. You know, he does this all in this very like egotistic kind of way. Very selfish. He does this all for very selfish reasons, but he does it. And I think that fails. I think human beings need altruism in their societies to flourish. But it's easy to criticize an altruist in a room full of assholes. So, yeah. Yeah, you know what it is. So, all right. Yeah. 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 Not a lot else to say. I'm really thinking. My brain is like steaming. Yeah, not a lot else to say about that. Okay. Well, that's all. That's all I was gonna do today. I have some other stuff to do, but it's not really stuff I can do on my computer, so it's over. Thank you. Once again, thank you for watching Productivity Maximization Index. Remember, we are brought to you by BXF20XX, the RPG, on Steam soon. Wishlist it when you see it.